Economic facts and fallacies. Quote, the biggest economic fallacy about housing is that affordable housing requires government intervention, close quote. Now, Tom, I have to remonstrate with you. No poor person would be able to live on the island of Manhattan or in the city of San Francisco if there weren't rent control or subsidized low-income housing that these cities forced builders to set aside when they built their high-rises for rich people. Isn't that manifestly true?
No, it's not even remotely true.
All right, explain. Explain.
Well, first history. There were more people, I believe, living in Manhattan prior to the rise of rent control and prior to the rise of government housing projects. My gosh, at one time, the Lower East Side of New York was the most tightly packed place in the world. New York and San Francisco have very long rent control laws, old ones and severe ones. And yet when you look at the cities with the highest rents in the country of any major cities, they are number one, New York, and number two, San Francisco.
So what's going on?
Well,
Why does the political system produce a perverse outcome, which is then supported in the press? Try to mention a repeal of rent control, and the New York Times will go after you immediately.
Absolutely. What happens in rent control around the world, really, because it's been tried so many times, is that people, if the rent control is severe, the people either reduce the amount of housing they build, or they stop building housing altogether. And so what happens, the political authorities are then confronted with a situation. Do you want to have a situation where there's no new housing built and the old housing is wearing out, usually faster under rent control, because the landlords don't have to keep it up as much. And so they step in and they'll have some kind of modification so that, well, let's say we're trying to protect the poor, so we won't regulate luxury housing. Of course, luxury housing and ordinary housing use much of the same labor, the same materials. And so therefore, all the materials that would otherwise have gone into making ordinary housing goes into building luxury housing.
Economic facts and fallacies once again. If we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, before government intervention became pervasive in housing markets, we find, and this is to me one of the most arresting assertions in the book, we find people paying a smaller percentage of their expenditures for housing than at the end of the 20th century. In 1901, housing costs took 23% of the average American family's spending. By 2003, it took 33% of a far larger amount of spending. What's going on?
What's going on is that they're restricting the amount of housing that can be built. And obviously, if you restrict the supply while the demand is growing, the prices will go up through the roof.
Cui bono? Who benefits from this arrangement?
Politicians most of all.
How?
Because they get the reputation of being for the poor and the downtrodden, and that they're setting aside affordable housing units, usually in some token amounts. They are preventing the evil landlords from raising the rent by rent control, and if they are able to keep the public paranoid that if they take off the rent control, it'll be just sky-high prices, and so they gain by that. Both the landlords and the tenants lose. They lose in different ways and to different extents. The tenants lose because they can't find a place to stay. The landlords lose because they don't make the profit they would have made otherwise. The builders lose because there's no demand for apartment buildings if nobody can make a profit on it.
All right. Economic facts and fallacies once again. Quote, where builders are allowed to construct homes and apartments without severe government restrictions, even growing populations and rising incomes do not cause housing prices to shoot up because the supply of newly constructed housing keeps up with the growing demand, as in Houston. Now, would you please contrast Houston with our own coastal California?
Oh my goodness, there couldn't be a greater
contrast. An easy one.
Yes, that's an easy one. Houston doesn't even have zoning laws, whereas to build anything in coastal California is just an ordeal. I mean, you have to not only you have to go through all kinds of planning commissions. I've had the misfortune of sitting in on 2 planning commission meetings. I don't know what it did for my blood pressure watching these people. The discouragement is huge. So someone estimated, for example, a real estate company, that a house that would cost $155,000 in Houston would cost $1 million in San Francisco. Right. The same house.
Now, but Tom, what about a place like Las Vegas, which overbuilt dramatically. And now there are it's going to take who knows how many years for the already in place housing stock in Las Vegas to get purchased. Meanwhile, of course, it's declining. We could have used a little regulation there, couldn't we?
Well, the regulation was one of the problems. I don't think it's going to take years, unless the government intervenes as it has to keep the prices from falling. The people who own the empty houses have every incentive to rent the houses for whatever they can get. Whether that's, I had the very same problem here on the Stanford campus when I moved away, that I didn't sell my house immediately, and so I rented it out. And I rented it out for an amount that was $100 a month, less than the mortgage payment, because the alternative would be to have it sit empty and pay the whole mortgage payment myself.